Hello, everybody, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where our goal is to make you a better investor in the commodities sector. My name is Jesse Day. Before we dive in, standard disclaimer: nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's guest is the CEO of Leading Edge Materials, a company focused on developing a portfolio of critical raw material projects located in the European Union. It's Kurt Budge. Great to have you on the show.
Hi, Jesse. Good to be here.
Yes, great to have you. I want to start things off with discussing the macro environment and supply demand dynamics for the critical materials you're involved with, and then dive into leading edge specifically. I want to start with graphite, a commodity that doesn't get a lot of attention. So could you walk us through what you see as the current main demand drivers for graphite? What does the supply demand picture look like? And why should investors be paying attention to this commodity?
I think the main driver is clearly the energy transition. And within that, the increased adoption of electric vehicles and the expansion of renewables generation. So for both of those sectors, you need lithium-ion batteries or batteries that have anodes that require graphite. And graphite is, to most commentators, seen to be the key material of choice for anode material for the next decade at least. So it remains fundamentally important in terms of this overall objective of addressing climate change and electrification of society. Within Europe, there are only a handful of graphite projects and even fewer graphite mines. And within the European Union, we've got the only built and permitted graphite mine. So what's happened, and we'll come on to rare earths in a minute, but is, Chinese dominance of the market and control and the ability to turn supply on or off and by extension impact pricing to their advantage. And so what you've got in the European conversation is around an over-dependence on China and the need for diversification, both for security of supply reasons mainly.
Yeah, and I want to touch on the China story in a moment as well. Let's talk about rare earths now. Could you provide some color on that sector of the commodity space, and which rare earth elements specifically do you think people should be watching at this point in time?
So again, we'll start with China. Their capability has been built up over decades in terms of both mining and processing, such that they again have dominance and control. And this has been a long-term goal. And we've sort of, markets outside of China have relied on buying the quality they want at the best price and not necessarily thinking that the status quo that we've experienced in the past in terms of geopolitics will remain the state of play going forward. And clearly what we find in recent years is initially, new conflicts, specifically in Europe, the war in Ukraine, and then by extension, what we find is trade initiatives by different countries, whether or not it be export restrictions or tariffs, what have you. So the whole playing field is sort of being moved around, but fundamentally, China controls rare earths, and so the European is almost dependent to 100% on Chinese supply. When it comes to leading edge, our project, Nora Share, has got 52% of its rare earths described as heavies. And so that's a portion of the periodic table. And specific to Nora Share is dysprosium and terbium. And they're going into permanent magnets, which goes into electric vehicle motors or wind turbines. So really strategically important industries and sectors when you think about the green transition, electrification of society. But yet we don't have the ability to produce our own primary raw materials. So that's why, when you touched on at the very beginning, leading edge's positioning is critical raw materials in the EU. When it comes to rare earths, we've got one of the strategically important projects for heavy rare earth supply to the EU.
Well, let's talk about the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU. I'm going to read a quote from it. It says, "The regulation will strengthen all stages of the European critical raw materials value chain, diversifying the EU's imports to reduce strategic dependencies, improve EU capacity to monitor and mitigate risks of disruption to the supply of critical raw materials, and improve circularity and sustainability." Give us your thoughts on what this act means for the mining of these critical materials in the EU.
I think this kind of a policy has been long in waiting for. I think, again, specific to North Share, underneath the policy, you get the strategic project status. And we've applied for strategic project status for North Share in August of this year. If we get strategic project status, it gives you three key benefits. One is a legal timeframe for permitting. And one of the challenges, not just for us as a company, but many companies operating either in Europe or around the world, is getting the license to operate. And so the strategic project status will puts a 27-month time frame on getting your permits for an extraction project. Also, the EU is going to step up and look to facilitate capital support, investment into mining projects. So you've got institutions like European Investment Bank that are becoming more active in looking at projects within the region. And we're also seeing grant funding. If we just quickly go back to graphite, grant funding into innovation funding going into the graphite anode materials supply chain. We've seen one of those investments recently. So permitting timeline, access to capital, and finally the EU taking on a role to facilitate offtake arrangements between different players in the supply chain. This is all about establishing capability, security of supply, diversification of primary raw materials, but they're actually creating the capability that we've just outsourced to China over decades. So in my career operating in this neck of the woods, it's quite an exciting time in terms of policy. Now what we need to see is real action, but we're already seeing that.
Well, I want to circle back to China. They continue to restrict exports of critical materials to the West. I want to read a quote here from Le Monde. It says, "The Chinese government has announced that it will no longer issue export licenses for rare earths such as gallium, germanium, and antimony to the United States. This marks a new chapter in the technological war between the world's two leading powers." I would assume that in some cases that's going to extend to Europe as well, depending on how things play out on the geopolitical chessboard. We're seeing this kind of bifurcation of East and West in some sense, and this kind of usage of commodities as a kind of what you might call a resource war, restricting exports. I believe we've seen China do something similar with graphite in the past too. And obviously, this is a trend that could certainly continue. I wonder what your thoughts are. How could this affect the supply-demand fundamentals of these metals? And how important is it for domestically sourced production like your own to be out there?
I think the problem with some of these markets is transparency overall. Is the opacity of the market, and let's face it, nobody knows what is going to happen next. You just don't know. Nobody's telling you what trade policies they're going to implement or why they're going to do it. And so what we're seeing is a bit of tit for tat, and this conversation again, this realization of overdependency, and the fact that this isn't good. We need to do something about it. And the US has done the Inflation Reduction Act, and the EU's done the Critical Raw Materials Act, and other policies are being introduced around the world. So I think one of the things that is missing at the moment is that, so what you have is you can still buy China, for example, buy Chinese material at the market price. But that's clearly being dominated and controlled by Chinese. So, and there's no way of not buying Chinese production because our needs are so great. But what we do need to do is we need to have some sort of fallback position in terms of some of the supply that we need for strategically important requirements. Be that the energy transition, or in the case of rare earths, you know, defense and some really important technologies for the European Union. So I think one of the things that's talked about is whether or not you're going to have more than one market price, and so you're going to have a divergence in the market. And because clearly, while we have what we have now, which is one market, and the Chinese control of that market in terms of price, depressing the price stops new projects coming on stream unless they're supported by other means. And let's face it, that's been happening for many, many years in China in different ways, whether or not it be state-run enterprises or subsidies or whatever. But again, we just need to think a little bit more intelligently about this new sort of transition period of building capability, which we have outsourced to China over decades.
A great breakdown of the situation. I want to take a step back and look at the commodities sector more broadly, because we've heard a lot about a potential commodities super cycle. Some are calling it on the horizon. We have already seen significant moves, obviously, in gold, uranium. There was a nickel squeeze. Do you see hard assets and natural resources as a whole coming more into favor up ahead? You know, a lot of guests on this show also believe that the broad market is tremendously overvalued at the moment. I think it's hard to argue with that. So we could potentially see a rotation of capital from the tech sector potentially into commodities, which have been out of favor for quite some time. I wonder what your thoughts are on that whole commodities super cycle narrative.
In recent days, and you'll have to forgive me, but I spent some of my career working for Rio Tinto, and thankfully Rio Tinto just did an investor seminar in London on the 4th of December. And the themes that they're picking out in terms of what could support that commodity cycle and a sustained period of higher prices would be what response is taken to climate emergency, which is, you know, the energy transition in terms of electric mobility, and also renewables generation, but also beyond that, the metals intensity of other economies in the world. And specifically, they highlighted India and the ASEAN countries, so the Association of Southeast Asia Nations, and the economic prosperity of the individuals in those economies, and how when that goes to a certain level, you suddenly get a switch on in terms of metals intensity about how much is being consumed within those economies. So those are two, and the other one is to be cognizant of is this license to operate. There are more challenges to getting new mines up and running, and you know, if people are serious about ESG, and let's face it, when it comes to rare earths, some of Chinese supply comes from Myanmar. And I think if most people knew they were buying direct from Myanmar, would not be buying. So you've got, we talk about greater transparency, understanding, you know, who sits at the top of the supply chain in terms of the inputs into the product that you are using in your day-to-day lives, and understanding that and saying, okay, well, I'm not going to buy that, but I am going to buy, say, raw materials that are coming from a Swedish asset or a European asset, where I know that, you know, specifically with our projects, you can basically power them by renewables in Sweden, hydroelectricity, for example. So you can have a very low carbon footprint, a very high environmental standards, ESG standards of production, and all the controls, checks and balances. And that becomes our real competitive advantage, and people are willing to pay for that. So the energy transition, the new economies, you can, the restrictions and the opportunities that you get from being able to operate in certain parts of the world versus others, those would be sort of the key things. So I personally see, we're not yet seeing it, as you touched on. Investors are looking elsewhere at the moment, but things are changing, and hard, real assets will have their day, because you need the primary raw material production from those assets.
Absolutely agree. Let's pivot to discussing how leading edge materials fits into this whole picture. Could you start by giving us an overview of the company for those who are unfamiliar?
Yeah, well, you stole my strap line right at the top that it's critical raw materials projects all located in the EU. And specifically that is in Sweden, built and permitted Voxna natural graphite mine. And then we've got the Noreshare heavy rare earths project, which, fortuitously, we just put in the new application for a mining lease yesterday. So this podcast is timed very well. Then in Romania, we have polymetallic exploration. So brownfield exploration, which is exciting in its own right. We have 100% of Voxna, 100% ownership of Noreshare, and then at the moment 51%, but the rights to move to 90% of our exploration alliance in Romania. We're listed in Toronto and Stockholm principally, but we also trade in New York and in Frankfurt.
Great. Well, could you give us some insight into the team behind Leading Edge, starting with your own background and how you came to be CEO of the company?
I've been in the industry for 30 plus years now. I did a mining engineering degree at the Royal School of Mines, did an MBA at London Business School, worked for a variety of different companies, big and small, operations, corporate development, and finance. And then prior to joining Leading Edge, between 2014 and 2023, I was the CEO of another Swedish mining company called Beowulf Mining. We were listed in Stockholm and also London. And our flagship project within the company was the Noreshare the Kallak iron ore project north of Jokkmokk. And I was successful in getting the exploitation concession, 25-year mining lease for that project in March 2022. And I left the company a year later. So long experience in operating in Sweden and all the twists and turns of permitting mining operations. And I think, we're in a very different period at the moment for that. When you look at the rest of the board of Leading Edge, our chairman is Lars-Erik Johansson. He was the CEO of Ivanhoe Mines, one of Robert Friedland's companies. Lars-Erik was CEO of that Ivanhoe Mines for 13 years. And then in his long career, he's worked for Noranda, Kinross Gold, Falconbridge, and also Boliden. Eric Kraft is a non-executive director. Eric is our 38% shareholder. He's been investing in Leading Edge since 2016. He's an industrial investor, but he's got a specific interest in natural resources and those businesses that are facing into the green transition. And then finally, we've got Daniel Major. He's a non-executive director, and he's the CEO of GoviEx Uranium, also listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So I'm really lucky to have a board with really deep experience and competence about how you're successful in this industry.
Let's talk about your projects a little bit more in depth. You touched on them when you were giving an overview of the company, but I'm wondering if you could talk about infrastructure in place at these projects, relationship with local government, how current operations are progressing, plans for the future. Fill us in on those details if you could.
Yeah. So Voxna, the graphite mine, is built and permitted, and it's been sitting there for most of its operating life. Again, because the dynamics around the graphite market have never really played into its hands. So I'm a fresh pair of eyes arriving in May this year into the company, and that's what I've been doing. I've been looking at Voxna to see what options are available to us. Because again, we've talked about the graphite supply and demand situation and the green transition and all of that. And you've got to think that there is an opportunity for what is Europe's only built and permitted mine to actually find its niche. And that could be in the lithium ion battery space, or it could be in more traditional markets. So it's, if we can find the right business case, which is what I'm on with at the moment, then the leverage to switching the mine on as an asset that will generate value for the company is great, because it's just sitting there. The relations with local authorities are great. We're operating in an area that's used to mining, which is always a real bonus. And I was on site in early October, and I met with the local county administrative board. The mine's been on care and maintenance for a number of years, but we're managing it environmentally. So those relations are very good. And, we're filing all our regulatory filings on time and everything. So So that's the assets there. It's good relations locally, being managed well. If you switch it on, it can produce 10,000 tons a year of 94% carbon, graphitic carbon, flake graphite concentrate. I'm looking at ways to optimize that, and also whether or not you want to go further downstream. So that's Voxner. With Norashare, it's been a project that's been known about since the early 1900s. It was discovered by the Swedish Geological Survey way back when. They decided it was a deposit of national interest in 2011, which is not a bad thing to have in Sweden. That protects its the likely production of rare earths from Norashare because they're of strategic importance to both Sweden and the EU. In the terms of the European conversation around strategically important assets, specific around rare earths and heavy rare earths, Norashare has been one of the key projects that's been talked about for over a decade. And now, as we've touched on earlier in our conversation, we've got the Critical Raw Materials Act. So you've got all of these things stacking up to saying you've known about this project for many, many years. When it comes to leading edges involvement and the companies just before us, 15 years of technical work. So the culmination of that was a pre-feasibility study done in 2015. And then what could be perceived by investors as a step back to a scoping study in 2021. But the scoping study, the preliminary economic assessment, was done at that level because the project was redesigned. The footprint of the project was massively reduced. All industrial activities, chemical processing, are now happening elsewhere. So what you've got effectively at site is a quarry, and then the addition of new product lines into the project. So we have a heavy rare earth concentrate, magnetic concentrate leaving site, but also an industrial mineral nepheline cyanide. So what we're looking at doing is trying to make products from as much material as we dig out the ground as possible. With the goal being 100%, but you can never get to 100%, but we're going to work our way to getting close to that. At the moment, we can see that 60% of the material that we excavate, we can turn into a product. And so that's why I've been saying this is a quarry, not a classical mining operation with lots of intensive processing, downstream processing. There's been a complete decoupling of upstream and that downstream processing on two separate locations. So that's Norashare. As I touched on, the mining lease has gone in. Application went in yesterday, the new mining lease. And then in August, we submitted the strategic project application to the European Union under the Critical Raw Materials Act. And then finally, in Romania, Romania is a brownfield exploration program in an area that has been mined historically. We've got access to kilometers and kilometers of underground development. So I've said on other conversations, we're already underground with drill rigs inside what we hope is the guts of a deposit, rather than your classical exploration from surface, where you're trying to, through geophysics and sampling or whatever, and geological observation, trying to figure out what's happening below. We're actually inside and looking and seeing, observing mineralization. We've had some slow progress through the autumn, so that's why there haven't been any updates to the market. But we've just hired a new geologist in the company. We're looking at bringing a second drill rig onto site in the new year. So from January onwards, we're really looking to increase the activity at site and the news flow that comes from it. And in the specific gallery we're most interested in, we have hundreds of meters of polymetallic mineralization. So lead, zinc, silver, and copper. So that's very exciting in its own right. That's the company.
Yeah, great rundown. You've got massive insider ownership of over 40%. Obviously, shareholders love to see management with that degree of skin in the game. Talk to us about that level of insider ownership and the importance of aligning with shareholders. And is there more insider buying planned for the future?
Well, I think the Eric Kraft, who owns 38% of the company, has been investing in leading edge now since 2016. He initially invested because of Voxner. That was what particularly interested him. But clearly, Nora share has been sitting there and has really, come into its own because of all the changes that have happened and the way, geopolitics and the need for rare earth elements in Europe and all those other factors that we've talked about. And we have the luxury to some degree, because of his commitment, that when we do non-brokered private placements, typically that his is the first name on the book build. And what also we have, which isn't always the case with, say, a developing company like Leading Edge Materials, is that the investors that are being brought into these non-broker private placements are like-minded long-term investors. They're not looking to flip the stock. So there is there's a theme running here about commitment to the long term and actually building something and making something happen. So I think we differentiate ourselves from some of the other companies you might talk to. It's a real benefit.
Well, I'd like to end by opening the floor to you. Anything you want to discuss about the company that we haven't touched on, anything that you would like to emphasize perhaps that we've already discussed, if you want to talk about upcoming catalysts for the company, whatever you think is important for potential shareholders to know about Leading Edge Materials.
I mean, it won't surprise you that I'm going to say 2025 is looking like it's going to be a really great year for the company, because most CEOs would say that. But when it comes to us, we've got a decision to be taken on the strategic project status for Nora share, and we're expecting that in Q1. Nora share is described as Europe's most advanced heavy rare earth project. So I'm really struggling to see the scenario where the strategic project status isn't awarded. So that's really exciting. If we get that, then that puts the clock on and the focus on permitting the project, and so we will hopefully get a decision on the mining lease sometime later next year. Alongside that, we're looking at starting pre-feasibility study on the new project. Clearly, there's a lot of technical work that's been done in the past. So got that and got environmental permitting. But you've got these two key milestones with Nora share, which is strategic project status, mining lease, and then kicking off pre-feasibility. And with Voxner, it's a case of me fleshing out the restart options and trying to make something happen there. But the value of that asset going forward is only going to increase because of the nature of the structure of the graphite market as it currently stands and where Europe is buying from. And then finally, with Romania and Bihor Sud, we touched on the fact that we're looking to increase the resources that are on site. So there'll be a much greater level of activity and from that news flow. So we're hoping for exploration success there. So yeah, a lot going on.
Great. Well, I'll put a link in the description below to the company's website, as well as social media profile for people who want to follow the story moving forward. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Kurt, and sharing your knowledge with the audience.
Thanks very much, Jesse.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.